If you would do me the honor,
Oh, God.
will you please marry me?
These are the moments.
I asked you to hold off and wait so she could prove herself. And then you just go walk up and pull this little sneak.
If you would do me the honor, will you please marry me? And just like that, the entire mood of this story changes for a second. Because Sheena freezes, Forrest looks terrified in that way people do when they already know their life is about to split into a before and after, and then she says yes. And for one brief, clean moment, it feels like nothing else matters. Not the suspicion, not the tension, not the constant pressure hanging over them, not even the fact that this relationship has spent so much of its time fighting for air instead of enjoying peace. Because in that one emotional burst, all you see is relief, happiness, and two people acting like they finally reached the moment they were supposed to reach a long time ago. But that is exactly why this opening matters so much. Because the proposal is not the full story here, it is the bait. It is the emotional high that pulls you in, before the real question starts creeping under the surface, and that question is much less comfortable than a simple engagement celebration. Because the real issue is not whether Forrest loves Sheena enough to put a ring on her finger. The real issue is whether Forrest only becomes this sure of her when Molly is nowhere near him. That is what makes the rewind matter. Because once you pull back from the proposal itself and go back to the start of the day, the whole thing looks different. And what should feel like a normal outing between a couple suddenly feels like evidence in a bigger emotional case, since Forrest and Sheena are not just going out together, they are escaping the noise long enough to remember what they even sound like when no one else is steering the conversation for them, and that is a pretty revealing place to begin, because it tells you that privacy is not just a luxury in this relationship. It is practically a requirement for basic honesty, which is strange enough on its own, but it gets even stranger when you realize Forrest is a grown man who seems to need physical distance from his mother just to talk seriously with the woman he has been with for years. And once that sinks in, the whole romantic setup stops feeling simple, because now the day is not just a date. It is a test, and not only of the relationship, but of who Forrest becomes when Molly is not standing close enough to influence the atmosphere. That is why even the sweetness of the outing carries tension under it. Because yes, the location is playful, yes, the dress-up moment is cute, yes, they seem lighter together than they have in almost any other moment, but the ease between them actually makes the situation more complicated, not less, because it forces a question that the rest of the story cannot avoid, which is why does this relationship look so much healthier the second Molly disappears from the frame? And if the answer is that Molly's presence changes everything, then that means the problem is bigger than one disagreement, one trust issue, or one awkward family clash. It means outside pressure has become part of the structure of the relationship itself, and once that happens, every happy moment becomes unstable. Because you are no longer only asking whether Forrest and Sheena love each other, you are asking whether their love can survive the environment around it. And to his credit, Forrest does not use the day only for romance, because underneath the nice setting and the softer mood there is something more serious waiting to come out, and that is the trust problem, the thing sitting quietly under all the surface chemistry. Because as much as he clearly wants to enjoy the moment with Sheena, he also wants answers. And that matters, because it keeps this from turning into fake fantasy. Since he is not pretending everything is perfect, he is walking into the conversation with real concern, real caution, and the kind of emotional hesitation that tells you he wants to move forward, but not blindly. And that is where the day stops being just a romantic reset and becomes something more valuable, because the trust conversation actually matters more than the proposal itself, or at least it should, since a relationship does not become safer. Because a ring appears, it becomes safer when the people inside it can finally tell the truth without fearing what that truth will cost them. That is also where Sheena becomes more than just the person on the receiving end of everybody else's opinions, because when she starts opening up, the story begins to shift. And suddenly the question is no longer only whether she hid things or whether Forrest has reason to worry. Now it becomes about why honesty feels so difficult for her in the first place, and that is a much heavier issue. Because what starts to emerge here is not the picture of someone casually lying for convenience, but someone who seems deeply afraid of what happens when trust breaks, someone whose past has left, damage that did not stay in the past, and even before every detail lands, the emotional shape of it starts becoming clear, because you can feel that this is not just about facts, it is about survival, about fear, about what people start doing when they have learned that love can be withdrawn, redirected, or exposed as fake without warning. And when someone has been hurt in that way before, honesty can start feeling less like freedom and more like risk. That does not erase the concern Forrest has, and it should not, because one of the reasons this section works is that it does not pretend explanation and resolution are the same thing, and Forrest knows that, which is why the atmosphere between them feels tender but not fully settled, because he is moved by her vulnerability. He clearly wants to protect her. He clearly wants to believe that the two of them can work through this, but there is still that quiet hesitation underneath it all, that sense that he is trying to trust the moment while also bracing himself for the possibility that more is still hidden, and that emotional split inside him is important, because it keeps the story honest, since if he instantly dropped every concern and acted like one emotional conversation fixed everything, the whole scene would feel hollow, but it does not feel hollow, it feels unfinished. And unfinished is exactly what makes it compelling. What makes it even more compelling is that the piece between them looks real, which almost makes it harder to watch, because it suggests that this relationship might actually have a functioning core when nobody else is intruding. And that possibility changes how you read everything else. Because if Forrest and Sheena were miserable together even in private, then the answer would be simple, but they are not. They are warm, affectionate, emotionally open, and noticeably more natural with each other when they are alone, and that means the central problem might not be lack of love at all. It might be that every outside voice hits this relationship like a storm, and Molly in particular does not stay in the category of background family concern. She moves to the center and changes the emotional weather every time she appears, which is why Forrest's confidence becomes such a fascinating thing to track, because around Sheena alone he sounds clearer, lighter, more direct, almost like a different man. And the minute you notice that, the proposal stops looking like a simple climax and starts looking like a clue. Because what is the proposal really proving here? That Forrest is ready for marriage, or that Forrest is only fully himself when Molly is not watching. And that is not a small distinction, because one version points toward growth while the other points toward dependence that has simply been paused for a day. And those are two very different futures, even if they can look identical in a romantic scene. Which is why this first chapter of the story has to end in a place that feels emotionally satisfying and psychologically dangerous at the same time. Because yes, Forrest and Sheena finally look like a couple with real joy between them. Yes, the emotional connection feels stronger once the pressure eases. And yes, there is something genuinely moving about the possibility that they can still find their way back to each other when they are given room to breathe. But that only makes the final question hit harder, because if this is who they become when Molly is gone, then what happens when the day is over, the private bubble breaks, and the one person who never seems willing to stay on the outside steps right back into the middle of their life? The deeper this conversation goes, the clearer it becomes that the real issue between Forrest and Sheena was never going to be solved by deciding who looked more innocent in the last argument, because that kind of simple verdict might satisfy people watching from the outside, but it does not tell you much about why two people keep falling into the same painful pattern. And what starts to come through here is that the trust problem is real. The hurt is real. The frustration is real. But the motivation underneath it is more complicated than a clean split between honesty and deception. Since Forrest is not sitting there asking for truth because he wants control, he is asking for it because he wants some kind of stability under his feet, some reason to believe that what he is building with Sheena is solid enough to hold, while Sheena is not shrinking away from the subject because she does not care what he feels. She is shrinking because the conversation is dragging her toward the exact kind of emotional exposure that already hurt her before, and that changes the whole rhythm of the scene. Because now, this is not just a couple revisiting a disagreement, it is two people trying to answer a much harder question, which is whether honesty in this relationship will lead to understanding or to loss. That is why Sheena opening up matters so much more than the engagement that comes later, because this is the point where the story stops being about whether she made the wrong choice and starts being about what fear does to a person who has already learned that love can look secure right up, until it turns out not to be real at all. And the shift is quiet at first, but once it lands, it changes everything. Because Sheena is no longer speaking like someone trying to dodge blame or smooth over tension. She is speaking like someone who has tied honesty to danger. Someone who has learned from past pain that getting close to people does not always make you safer. Sometimes it just gives them more access to hurt you. And when she starts talking about the partner who cheated on her, about being let down by the people she trusted, about feeling as if she somehow pushed someone away, even when she was the one betrayed, what you see is not just sadness, it is damage that has been turned inward, because that is the part that makes this moment heavier than a normal confession. The fact that she does not only carry the pain of what happened to her, she carries the blame for it too. And that kind of emotional wiring can distort everything that comes after it. Because once someone starts believing that being honest, being difficult, being emotional, or even simply being real might cause the person they love to leave, secrecy can start feeling less like manipulation and more like protection. And that does not make it healthy. And it definitely does. Not make it harmless, but it does make it understandable in a way that forces the audience to stop reading her like a flat character in a cheap story where one person lies and the other person just has to decide whether to forgive them, since what is being laid out here is much messier than that, and much more human. Because Sheena is not describing a calculated strategy, she is revealing a fear-based survival habit, the kind that does not announce itself as dishonesty when you are living inside it. It just feels like trying not to lose the person in front of you, trying not to say the thing that might shift the mood, trigger suspicion, or make you feel once again that the relationship has become unsafe. And that makes this scene emotionally effective, because it forces a second look, not in order to erase the damage, but in order to understand the machinery behind it. Still, understanding the machinery does not repair the damage by itself, and this is where Forrest becomes more interesting than he first appears, because he does not respond like a man who suddenly thinks all the problems are gone, and he also does not respond like someone who wants to punish Sheena for the rest of the day just because she has admitted where some of this comes from. Instead, he lands somewhere much more fragile and much more believable, because he is clearly moved by what she shares, clearly softened by it, clearly willing in that moment to meet her with reassurance rather than anger. But he also never fully sounds like someone who has put every concern to bed, and that tension inside him is important because it keeps the emotional progress from feeling fake, as though one heartfelt explanation automatically cleans up all the uncertainty that came before it, when in reality, trust never works that way, especially not when there were already cracks there, and especially not when outside voices have been feeding doubt into the relationship from the edges. So when Forrest tells her, in his own way, that they can work through things together if she is honest with him, that lands as a real offer, a real attempt to build something steadier between them, but it also lands with a condition attached, and not a cruel one, just an honest one, because what he is really saying is that he wants partnership, not guesswork, closeness, not confusion, and that is what makes his response emotionally strong, but still incomplete. Since he is not saying, I understand you now, and therefore I trust everything, he is saying, I want to understand you, and I want to move forward, but you have to meet me there, and that leaves the scene in a much richer place than simple reconciliation, because now both of them are trying, both of them are reaching, both of them are offering something real, and yet neither one is standing on anything fully secure. That unstable balance becomes even more fascinating when you remember Molly, because even though she is not physically in the middle of this conversation, her influence is still there like pressure in the walls, and it becomes impossible not to wonder how much of Forrest's anxiety belongs to him, alone, and how much of it has been sharpened by everything Molly has already poured into this relationship. Because there is a difference between a man noticing problems for himself and a man trying to sort through his own concerns, while somebody close to him keeps reinforcing the worst possible interpretation of every issue. And that distinction matters here, since Forrest's doubt feels real, but it also feels surrounded. And that is part of what keeps the audience uneasy even while the scene becomes more intimate, because you are not just asking whether Sheena is finally being fully honest, you are also asking whether Forrest even has enough emotional space to hear her clearly without Molly's suspicions echoing in the background. And Sheena's side of that same pressure matters too, because if she already came into this relationship carrying fear from the past, then being watched, judged, and questioned from the outside only makes openness harder, not easier, which means the relationship is stuck in a brutal loop where mistrust creates concealment, concealment creates more mistrust, and every outside voice pushing against them increases the chance that both people will react from defensiveness instead of calm, and that is why this section quietly becomes the real center of the story, because beneath the nice setting and the softer mood, what is actually being tested here is whether truth can survive in a relationship that does not feel emotionally private for very long. That is what gives the romantic atmosphere such a strange edge, because the more relaxed they seem, the more you start noticing how much the environment is helping them do emotional work they apparently struggle to do anywhere else. And that should feel encouraging, but it also feels dangerous, because calm can create the illusion that deeper problems have already been handled, when sometimes all it has really done is postpone the next impact. And this is where the story gets especially smart without needing to say much, because the closeness between Forrest and Sheena feels real there. Emotional connection feels restored in the moment, and yet there is still a quiet gap between feeling better and actually being better. A difference between a day that goes smoothly and a pattern that has been changed for good. And if you miss that difference, then the next development looks like a beautiful payoff, when in reality it is a test of whether this fragile repair can carry more weight than it has so far. By the time this part of their day settles, what you are left with is not a solved relationship, but a temporarily softer one. Not a full reset, but a moment where both people seem exhausted enough by fear and misunderstanding to finally reach toward each other instead of away. And that is meaningful. Maybe more meaningful than any big gesture that comes after it, because here the audience gets the emotional truth before it gets the spectacle. And that truth is that Sheena may not be hiding things because she wants to play games, Forrest may not be pushing for answers because he wants control, and the relationship may not be weak because love is missing, but because safety is inconsistent, because trust is partial, because outside pressure keeps turning private wounds into public tension, and because even when they are making progress, there is still that lingering, unsettling possibility that what feels like healing today might only be relief borrowed from a peaceful setting, which is exactly why the next move matters so much, because when a relationship is still this tender and this unfinished, the biggest commitment possible does not settle the deeper issue. It puts it under pressure and asks it to prove whether it was ever truly repaired at all.